The Notebook on Cities and Culture mailing list fires off regular updates about the show, and you, my friends, can subscribe. Visit colinmarshall.org and click Mailing List in the upper right column for details. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Just a moment ago, I described myself as obsessed with Los Angeles, and that's the reason I wanted this exact book that you wrote when you wrote it. Would you characterize yourself as Los Angeles obsessed?
I don't know if obsessed is quite the right word. I call myself more recently a Los Angeles chauvinist.
Los Angeles chauvinist.
I've really, well, I guess that is an obsession, isn't it? Yes. But, I'm a native Angelino. And I've gone through a number of ups and downs in terms of my relation to Los Angeles, my attitudes about Los Angeles. I grew up, just a part of Los Angeles without any kind of self-consciousness about what Los Angeles represented. But when I went to Berkeley, and I think that's often the case, if you go outside of a place, you get a different perspective of it. And this was in the 60s. And at that time, there's always been a rivalry between, Northern California and Southern California, which has historical roots, and maybe we'll get into that. But at that time, Los Angeles was kind of the enemy. It kind of symbolized the establishment in its worst sense, both culturally and politically, which it had, for some time, perhaps beyond that rivalry. So I bought into that. I became very much of a Berkeley person and thought I would never return to Los Angeles. And I lived in Europe for a number of years, went back and forth, eventually returned to Los Angeles somewhat grudgingly, but at a time when Los Angeles was going through a major radical change that I discuss in my book, and anybody who has lived through Los Angeles over that period of time can't help but acknowledge it, both politically and culturally, which I describe in my book. And the Los Angeles Times was a major factor in that, because the Los Angeles Times had been previously one of the main sources of the conservative entrenchment of Los Angeles throughout its American history, post-Mexican and Spanish history. And it went through a complete turnaround in the 60s due to the new owner, the Otis Chandler, and his mother, Dorothy Chandler, who then also enhanced the cultural expansion of Los Angeles. So I returned just at a propitious time to be more favorably inclined towards Los Angeles. I also lived in a different part of Los Angeles than I had previously. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. I'm a valley boy. And I saw immense changes there, too. I grew up on a chicken farm just at a time when the valley was burgeoning as this major suburban center in Los Angeles. So then when I returned, I lived in Venice, which was kind of the flip side of the San Fernando Valley. So it gave me another perspective from that standpoint. And so I grew gradually to appreciate Los Angeles and what it had to offer. Then when I moved to Silver Lake, that just further enhanced my sense of the richness and the diversity of Los Angeles, which has only increased since then, I think. So, and I've been very actively involved in community politics in Silver Lake. I guess we better pause here for another intrusion. This is a major thoroughfare here, and we get all aspects, the good, bad, and the ugly here. So where did your question begin there with my obsession with Los Angeles? So increasingly, I would say my chauvinist attitude towards Los Angeles begins with Silver Lake, and it kind of spreads out from there, because Silver Lake is somewhat of an island, I think, within Los Angeles. It's not absolutely unique. There are other similar islands of sanity, I would say, of diversity, of bohemianness, and openness and tolerance and so on, which appeals to me. And so with that as kind of a base, and seeing those kinds of attitudes also, not that Silver Lake was the cause of it and everything radiates out from that, but my appreciation of Los Angeles has kind of gone outward from there. With, again, self-critical chauvinist. I'm very aware of the problems, very severe problems that still exist, and so on. As this most recent incident, the Dorner incident, if you will, has brought to the fore again, open some old wounds, I think, racial wounds and so on within Los Angeles. So, but in other ways, I've really become let's call it obsessed with Los Angeles.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Silver Lake, Los Angeles, with Vincent Brook, who teaches at USC, UCLA, Pierce College, and Cal State. California State doesn't sound right. Cal State, Los Angeles. He's written books on Jewish émigré directors and film noir. He's written a book on the Jewish sitcom. He's written a book most recently, which is a cultural history of Los Angeles called Land of Smoke and Mirrors. That is the book I'm referring to when I say exactly the book I want to read right now. You mentioned the old wounds torn open by this pursuit of Christopher Dorner that the whole nation knows about. What old wounds do you see? What historical resonances do you feel from that sort of news event?
Yes, I had a very direct experience of that. I mean, I've been picked up a sense, from the periphery that the African American community has reacted to this very differently, as they did with the O.J. Simpson case, and they did to a certain degree with the case in Florida. I can't remember the guy's name now, who was killed there, and I don't... anyway... these cases, they tend to open old wounds that we would like to think are behind us, with the Obama presidency and the Obama era, if you will, so-called era of post-ethnicity and so on. And, this just virulent kind of somewhat counterintuitive, one would say, from a non-black perspective, of the reaction to the Dorner incident, where Dorner would seem to be the absolute villain of the piece from one perspective, right? But from a black perspective, not at all. It's much more complex than that. And I was discussing it with a black friend here in Silver Lake, who was just going on. It was a rant, really, that went on. And, oh, yes, I mean, it obviously touched a real major button. Alarm bell went off in terms of profiling and racism and so on. That, again, Los Angeles has a very dark record, so to speak, in terms of racism. It was a virulently racist place, and we talked about the Los Angeles Times as being one of the main, not causes of it, but one of the main promoters of it. As I mentioned in my book, and this is not new, the Los Angeles Times openly promoted Los Angeles, this is from the late 1800s into the early 1900s and maybe into the mid-1900s, as the white spot.
Yes.
Which meant
language in these days.
Which meant white Protestant, so there was a religious component to it as well. And then, of course, we know the LAPD has a horrific record that I was reminded of again in terms of it's being glossed over in the recent film Gangster Squad, which painted William Parker as this kind of heroic figure, which on some level he was, in terms of cleaning up the police department, in terms of some aspect of their corruption, but he certainly did not clean up the racism. If anything, he exacerbated it.
I did wonder what you thought about that film, Gangster Squad, because I was excited because it was a restoration of historical Los Angeles. Then I heard that it, not to put too fine a point on it, but sucked.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a guilty pleasure, if anything. It's a wildly melodramatic and hyperbolic view of Los Angeles during that period. And it gets so much wrong. I'm writing, and may end up writing a review about it. I've had too many other things going on. But, you want me to go into detail about the historical inaccuracies of it? I mean, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. I don't know if you'd call this dangerous, but it's certainly problematic. It tries to show how historically accurate it is by beginning in 1949 and showing us the Hollywood land sign. You say, look, it's not the Hollywood sign, it's the Hollywood land sign. Now, they get it right in terms of the Hollywood land sign preceded the Hollywood sign, but by 1949 the land was gone, and that was precisely the year that it was changed to the Hollywood sign to promote Hollywood rather than initially this residential development that was building on Hollywood and taking advantage of that. So it starts with that, but then it just goes from bad to worse. I mean, that's kind of that's a minor quirk. But then the way, first Mickey Cohen, the way he's portrayed is totally false. But again, the way William Parker is portrayed as being a heroic figure, and in some ways, again, in terms of cleaning up some of the corruption in the police department, but it completely glosses over his racism. That's not dealt with at all. And, there are more technical details. It acts as if Mickey Cohen was, it claims that he was finally caught because of a murder case, when that wasn't all the case. He was caught, as many of the mobsters were, on tax evasion charges, which, of course, is not as glamorous a way to be caught. So
it was good enough for Al Capone.
It was good enough for Al Capone, but not for Mickey Cohen. And then it makes it appear as if that was the end of Mickey Cohen in 1951. But he went to jail on tax evasion charges, which were federally applied, not by Los Angeles, not by the Los Angeles Police Department. So it was really the FBI that got him, rather than the police department. And then he was released in 1954 and went back to being a gangster for a number of years, and then was caught on tax evasion charges again. Okay, but let's not focus too much on that, except the racist element. The way William Parker is portrayed, I think, is its most damaging aspect in terms of misinformation, giving this false, again, covered-up view of Los Angeles, which, has gone through a major turnaround, but that was not the period when it went through it. It was in the 60s through Otis Chandler, and still the police department did not go through those changes yet until after the Rodney King episode in 1992. And that's why this Dorner incident is somewhat troubling, but again, also just revealing in terms of the issues that still exist. There's a wonderful lawyer in Los Angeles who's been dealing with police issues for a number of years, Connie Rice, and she's been one of the major watchdogs on the police department, very critical of it throughout its more virulently racist period. And she's come out quite openly now in terms of this seemingly overreaction within the... And she's black, by the way, in terms of the African-American response. And, of course, it's not across the board in the African-American community. This is a facet within the African-American community that has been focusing on, more the racist element in terms of Dorner's accusations about the police department rather than his, I think, quite clear overreaction in terms of dealing with it. And she is quite open, and again, she's someone on the inside who has been allowed on the inside despite being a very critical watchdog of the police department for decades now, and says that it really has cleaned itself up, certainly from the top down. Now, she admits that there's still facets, there are going to be more than rotten eggs, there are going to be certain pockets of racism within the culture of the police department that have not been rooted out, and she's quite open to the possibility that Dorner may have been discriminated against in this particular case. But certainly that doesn't justify the way he responded to it. But again, it reveals how deeply rooted this racist element within Los Angeles goes, and still has a ways to go in terms of really being resolved.
We had on this show a few months ago Tom Anderson, the maker of Los Angeles Plays Itself, the documentary which has this thrust to it saying that the geography of Los Angeles has been played with very fast and loose by the films. You discuss in Land of Smoke and Mirrors the way that history gets played fast and loose with, Chinatown being perhaps the locus classicus of just enough reality, just enough fudging to confuse people. Do you think that the history of Los Angeles has been on the whole well or poorly served by film and literature?
That's a complex question, because as I attempt at least to get across in my book, myth and history, or factual history, if you will, reality and rhetoric, and mesh in Los Angeles to a greater degree than I think in any other major city, perhaps in the history of humankind. So it's almost impossible to separate the two. The myth and the rhetoric is a part of its history that other observers have pointed out. So on the one hand, one should attempt to try to discern what is the factual basis, as I just did with Gangster Squad, and yet to admit that the mythical quality of Los Angeles is a part of its reality. That's part of the postmodern aspect that lends that notion of LA being the postmodern capital, of the world, if you will. That is fascinating, and that's part of being a media studies, professor and dealing with the media. itself, that's part of my obsession with Los Angeles. One should still try to carve out, and separate what is the history, the more factual basis from the myth, but then acknowledge that mythical aspect then becomes just another layer of Los Angeles. When it's totally off the mark, and is really deceiving the audience in a more significant way, such as painting William Parker perhaps in a heroic way that he does not deserve to be, that's when it becomes more problematic. But I mean, a text to really crystallize that aspect that I begin with in my book is the novel and then movie versions of Ramona, which attempted to be really a progressive, reformist intercession in terms of historical analysis of Los Angeles, aiming to reform in the mistreatment of Indians at that time. This is the late 1800s. And to a certain degree achieves that in the novelization, in the novel itself, and in some of the filmic adaptations of it, but ends up then being misused and abused by the power structure in Los Angeles, which then use it to romanticize this Spanish fantasy past, as I mentioned, throughout the book. Use it to then sell Los Angeles, promote it as a white Protestant center. That's LA in a nutshell. Using something that on its surface is really promoting a Spanish fantasy past, and is aiming to reform mistreatment of Indians, and it ends up doing quite the opposite. But then that becomes a part of the reality of Los Angeles. This abuse of history is precisely another facet of Los Angeles, which then you can, to enhance the significance of it, it isn't only Los Angeles. Los Angeles then becomes a microcosm of the United States. And if we go back to Chinatown, which I think Robert Towne was doing with Los Angeles too. He was also obsessed with Los Angeles and was a Los Angeles historian and a native of Los Angeles and so on, and loved Los Angeles to a certain degree, aware of its blemishes, was exposing those quite significantly in the film, but it also served as a microcosm for the corruption and the abuses of history in the United States as well, historically and at that time. It came out in 1974, and it deals with water at the time when America was dealing with Watergate, and you couldn't help but make that connection, So that's another of the interesting things about Los Angeles, that it on the one hand, it tends to be insular and be narcissistic about itself, but in that very narcissism, in that exceptionalism, if you will, it is again reflecting a lot about the United States, and of course through Hollywood then projects those attitudes outward.
Would you say that a creator of culture about Los Angeles, be it film, literature, or what have you, can never be sure how their work is going to be interpreted, reinterpreted, repurposed, more so than in other places?
I don't know about that. I mean, sort of L.A. leaves itself open, and has been kind of a whipping boy and a scapegoat for, all the problems in modernity and then post-modernity. So on the one hand, it's extolled for that reason, and then is also, critiqued for that reason as well. So, and yet all of this feeds back into Los Angeles. That's another fascinating thing about Los Angeles. All the negativity kind of feeds back into Los Angeles in a way that you could say that Hollywood itself kind of co-opts more critical and progressive movements within culture and politics, and kind of absorbs them and then turns them into something that's more palatable and more accessible. Los Angeles kind of does that too. It takes all these quirks and critical aspects that people like to thrust upon it, as the scapegoat, and kind of, if you will, it becomes a repository, the unconscious, and then its return of the repressed, brings those things back and gains greater credence on some level because of that. Of course, another major turning point in Los Angeles rhetorical history and attitudes about Los Angeles is Reyner Banham. I mean, that can't be overestimated, how significant a factor he was. I just caught for the first time, there's apparently a YouTube now copy of a film that he made in the early 70s after his book. Have you seen that?
Reyner Banham Loves Los Angeles.
Yes.
It's a BBC film. Yeah, I've watched it many times.
Yes, and I just saw it for the first time now. And what he did was turn around a lot of this negativity in a very self-conscious way, and a genuine kind of appreciation of what Los Angeles represented in all its complexity, and turn some of these negative aspects without being an uncritical booster, which Los Angeles had done previously with things like Ramona, right? He didn't do a Ramona trick on Los Angeles. He was very open and honest about the problems. He missed some of the problems and maybe didn't focus enough on some of the racial problems and so on. But in other ways, he turned some of the negative aspects into, for instance, sprawl and monotony. He turned into complex unity, things of that sort. And then of course, he was ahead of the time in terms of looking at it in ecological terms and environmental terms, part of the new urbanism of that period. So he's a significant factor, I think, in turning things around. But then people like Norman Klein and Mike Davis and others have pointed out how even film noir, which I disagree with some people. I think Mike Davis, in some point, says that, Eastern intellectuals, use film noir as a whipping boy, a way to castigate Los Angeles as this, hellish place. On the other hand, that makes it more exciting. It's not just paradise and palm trees and beaches, It has this darker side that obviously makes it more intriguing and exciting and mysterious. And the Sin City aspect of Hollywood, which it has always had. It's not only glamour and glitz, it's the scandals that continue to this day, that continue to draw people to Los Angeles and Hollywood.
When you were speaking of Los Angeles as whipping boy, and right before you brought up Reyner Banham, I got thinking about his quote from Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies, right near the beginning. Los Angeles has received attention, but it's the attention Sodom and Gomorrah have received, primarily a reflection of other people's bad consciences. To what extent would you also assert that?
Yes, well, the difference between L.A. and Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by God. And Los Angeles exists, although there have been attempts to destroy it, right, through the riots. And it does destroy itself through Hollywood. Hollywood is continually destroying Los Angeles, right? The last one, I think, being 2012, the movie, right? Yes. So it incorporates that notion of Sodom and Gomorrah, again, within its very self-image. Yes, I wanted to tell a little joke, if I might, about Los Angeles and Hollywood, that encapsulates some of this sort of negative appeal, if you will. The sort of paradoxical appeal of Los Angeles. I don't know the vintage of this joke, but it's a so-called ghost, shaggy dog story. I don't know if people have that term anymore, but and I'm going to abridge it here. It could go on forever. But God calls the Holy Ghost together. The Holy Host, excuse me, not the Holy Ghost. Okay, you might call the Holy Ghost. The Holy Host together in heaven because it's Sodom and Gomorrah time again. This is in the 20th century now. And he says there are three cities especially, that we have to look at very closely in terms of cleaning up Earth's act. And they are Paris, New York, and Hollywood. And but St. Teresa pipes up and says, yes, I'm sure there are evil places, but I'm sure there must be also a few good people there as well. And should we destroy the whole cities and destroy these innocent people as well? And God says, okay, I'll grant you that, St. Teresa. If you can go down there, and if you can find any good people, okay, I will spare those cities. So she goes to Paris, and a few days later comes back and says, God, you're right, it's a very evil place. But I did find quite a few, a whole block of good people, neighborhood that are worth saving. And so God says, okay, Paris is saved. So she goes to New York, and a couple of weeks later she says, boy, New York is even worse than Paris. But I did find a couple there that are really very pious and good people, and I think you should spare New York. Okay, New York is spared. So she goes to Hollywood. Weeks pass, months pass, and God is getting worried. Finally, there's a call in heaven, and it's God says yes, and he says, "Hello, God. This is Terry."
Even after reading that joke in your book, I still laugh at it. I still laugh. It's still funny.
I blew it a little bit. I didn't get that call bit in there.
It's still, even knowing what's coming, it's one of those jokes that's still funny because there's so much, undergirding it.
And it just, encapsulates that. Yeah, yes, okay, it's a sacrilegious place, but there's Terry there, and you too can be converted, right? And we know that this attitude still exists. Hollywood is the hotbed of evil, and now it's sort of video games for some reason. Now they're the evil incarnate. It used to be Hollywood in general and violent. Obama was even talking about the violence in Hollywood, but now it's video games, so they leave Hollywood sort of off the hook. But video games sort of represents Hollywood, a facet of Hollywood as well. Yeah, and we could get into other aspects of the anti-Semitism, and of course that plays a role in that joke itself. Here's Christianity being corrupted by the Jewish film industry, as well, which we know is quite overtly expressed in those days, and occasionally even here and there's a slip up, it's part of Martin Sheen or Mel Gibson and so on. Sure. So those attitudes still are prevalent, today. So we talk about the racist element that still goes deep, that anti-Semitic element within the film industry, that runs pretty deep too, and still every now and again that wound is reopened also.
You mentioned the destruction of Los Angeles that happens in many a Hollywood film, and this is something that Tom Anderson covers in Los Angeles Plays Itself from a different angle, and we mentioned Mike Davis, noted observer / critic of Los Angeles. Why? I want to get more of your perspective on this. Why do even people who like Los Angeles enjoy so much being told about how Los Angeles is bad?
Well, that goes back to the whipping boy and scapegoat about Los Angeles, the Sodom and Gomorrah aspect. If you can get rid of Sodom and Gomorrah / Hollywood, maybe God will like us better and we'll be better off for it. And again, it's Los Angeles, the geographical entity and what it represents there in terms of paradise, / hell, if you will, and the Hollywood film industry and what that represents. The two cannot be separated. But there's also, how can I put it? It becomes a sacrifice. Los Angeles becomes the sacrifice for the nation or the world in some degree, as Sodom and Gomorrah would be. We remove that cancerous growth, and then we'll be okay again. So it has that facet. But again, Los Angeles, as I try to get across in my title, Land of Smoke and Mirrors, I think what people take away from that initially is, Hollywood, right? And sleight of hand and special effects and illusionism and so on. And there's that aspect. Certainly there. But there's a very, very real smoke and mirrors aspect of Los Angeles. It was called the Valley of Smokes by the Indians. It invented smog, right? The wildfires that, have grown even more rampant over time. The riots, L.A. also is the center of riots. They didn't quite invent them, but they seem to have taken them to greater proportions. And as Banham brings out in terms of the mirror, of course, mirrors relate to the camera mechanism itself. In other words, a very real aspect of the illusionary product that emerges from it. And then Banham, another one of his great quotes is, he loved the car, right? People loved it. At that point, we're putting down the car and the sprawl and the smog that emanated from the car. And he saw it as another unique aspect of Los Angeles and related it to movies. He said, you're like going through a movie as you're driving at that time a little more speedily along the freeways. And then you have the rear view mirror. And the notion is you're driving in, you're in the present, driving into the future, and you look at the rearview mirror that's bringing in the past. And he said that's the best way to read Los Angeles. So mirrors, again, are a major metaphor, but again, real aspect of living in Los Angeles and an attitude about Los Angeles. So Los Angeles plays on that. Again, Los Angeles playing itself, right? That great title of Tom Anderson's. It loves to play on the fact that they know people want to see Los Angeles destroyed, and so they destroy Los Angeles, but again, in an illusionary way that cleanses people's notion of getting rid of Los Angeles, and it cleanses Los Angeles itself by being able to say, oh, look, we can destroy ourselves and come back another day, be resurrected. emerge from the smoke again another day. Yeah.
When you relocated first from Los Angeles to Berkeley and then to Europe, you mentioned Berkeley. They see Los Angeles as the enemy, and they convinced you of a few points. And many European cities, their residents are no fan of Los Angeles when they visit. Tell me what are the good points that Berkeley or the European cities you were in make about Los Angeles? When you internalized critiques in those places, which ones have stuck with you as, that's basically a sound, non-demonization type analysis of Los Angeles these other places have done, or are there those?
Okay, well, if we talk about Berkeley and the Bay Area, there's a very real reason for resentment towards Los Angeles that goes back historically, if I may just describe that briefly, that when California emerged in the American period, San Francisco was the biggest city, and of course the gold rush was the main attraction, but it ended up attracting a good deal of immigrants. At that time, Greek and Southern European and Eastern European immigrants, and many of them Catholics, and out of that grew a very strong union movement in San Francisco, whereas Los Angeles, as I had mentioned earlier, besides its racism, was an intensely anti-union city, again promoted very heavily and enforced by the Los Angeles Times, which I go into in great detail in my book. So there's a very real political conflict that existed over decades and into this new period when Los Angeles shifted. So there's that political element to, I think, resentment or demonizing of Los Angeles as being a conservative place, and then conservative culturally, this cultural backwater. And of course that's counterintuitive too, although it's also reinforced, and maybe that taps into the European element, because as we know, and I again discuss that in my other book about Jewish émigré directors and the rise of film noir, that Los Angeles was this magnet for the cream of European intellectuals and artists in the Nazi period. So to portray Los Angeles as this cultural backwater when it is really the Parnassus, it's been described as that, this Olympus of intellectual, musical artists and so on. All the great artists of the 20th century, in a sense, came here at one time or another, and they greatly enhanced the Hollywood film industry, were in very significant in terms of jump-starting film noir and so on. And so not only in Hollywood, but in almost every other realm. So, there's a disconnect there as well. But again, these Europeans who came here also looked at Los Angeles in this dissonant way, as being kind of aliens, here from this cheaper, Hollywood schlock aspect that has stuck to Los Angeles as well. So, there's a superiority complex, of always wanting to have somebody to look down on, and Los Angeles was a convenient, and being so close to San Francisco, and with this historical backdrop to it as well. So again, the political and the cultural aspect went hand in hand, I think, and San Francisco always looked at itself as being more sophisticated culturally, and to some degree, I think up to a point was. But this, again, radically shifted in the 60s and the 70s. Then there's the geographical aspect that, Los Angeles doesn't have what the Europeans, or the Germans anyway, would call a Stadtbild. That's a city image, that you come to a city, in many major cities around the world, in Europe and in the United States, certainly New York, San Francisco, have that, maybe Seattle as well, others. You come to the city, you sort of have a feel for it right off the bat, and there's certain iconic monuments, and you just, again, they're more traditionally dense, and it's easier to get a handle on the city. Los Angeles doesn't have that. I mean, we have the Hollywood sign, and maybe City Hall, and now maybe the Disney Hall as well. But due to the sprawl and the multi-centered aspect of Los Angeles, it doesn't have that. So it takes longer to get a feel for Los Angeles. And I don't think you ever quite get it in that sense. What you have to open yourself up to, as Banham did, was to another way of looking at a city. And I think arguably, and I've lived in other cities, I lived in the Bay Area, I lived in Europe, and I learned to appreciate those places as well. It's a very livable city. Again, people love to put down the smog and the sprawl and the traffic jams and so on, and there are those aspects. But in another way, it's a much more relaxing place. And of course, for some people, that's not a good thing. Then they use that to, again, browbeat Los Angeles. It makes you lazy intellectually. Woody Allen loves to play on that, right? And makes you superficial and materialistic and so on. And, those sorts of critiques are just so superficial and so cliched. I don't take those seriously at all.
They are superficial.
Not that there aren't plastic people in Los Angeles, and it becomes, again, the manufacturer of plasticity, for the world. And there is that aspect. But that's such a peripheral element of Los Angeles as it ever was, Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it, that even those cliched criticisms ascribe such a power to Los Angeles to make you into something. The critiques of other cities don't do that. I mean, they might say New York, are going to be unhappy in New York, or it's going to be expensive, but they don't say it's going to make you bad.
Right. Yes, these extreme reactions, and you always have to ask. I mean, Freud certainly would. What's your problem here? Are you projecting something? So it becomes the shadow image. It becomes, in Jungian terms. Again, everything we love to hate, but love to hate. Not everything, but, a lot of that is projected onto Los Angeles. And again, L.A. ends up eating it up in the end and just turning it into, co-opting it in some way and turning it into gold, if you will. And, people are still coming to Los Angeles. So what's the problem there? And again, there's the undeniable weather, as we're appreciating here in the winter, in the height of winter here, sitting out in the sun. Undeniable. And the geographical diversity. That's something that is very much underestimated that I try to get across. It's a beautiful place in so many ways. Silver Lake, one of the nicknames for Silver Lake is the Swish Alps.
Swish Alps?
I've never heard that one before. Okay, I mention it in my book, and I describe it. And the Swish, of course, comes from the history of gay and lesbian population in this area that still persists. Before West Hollywood, there was the Swish Alps. But it has these hillsides and the mountains, I have a friend from the Bay Area who's from Los Angeles originally, and he's moved to the Bay Area and has learned to love the Bay Area. But he says he misses those mountains. I mean, there was a great image in the LA Times just recently of showing the shoreline, the beach, and people on the beach, in their bikinis and so on. And in the background were the snow-capped mountains. And, of course, that was one of the major attractions for Hollywood or the film industry to come to Los Angeles, was this geographical diversity. It is quite striking that not that many major cities have as well. So, yes, there's geographical diversity and, of course, the increasing now demographic diversity since the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. And again, due to Los Angeles' proximity to the Pacific Rim and to Mesoamerica, has made it again the magnet of attraction to diverse peoples from around the world. So it's become the most diverse big city in the world now.
Tell me about your impressions of just on-the-ground, day-to-day experience of Los Angeles, the difference between growing up here, your first stretch here, and when you returned. How did the city feel different from part one of your life in Los Angeles to part two?
Thank you.
Okay, well, a lot of that is skewed by the fact that I was young, through high school in part one, and then I returned a little more mature in part two. But I guess the striking difference was and what contributed to my appreciation of Los Angeles was, and that is again a downside of Los Angeles as well, is that I had very little awareness of anything but the San Fernando Valley growing up, And of course, within the construct of the negativity about Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley is perhaps, at the bottom rung within Los Angeles, for many people. I mean, for some it might be South Central or whatever for various reasons. But in terms of that European Bay Area attitude about Los Angeles, the Valley would be kind of, the symbol of that kind of mediocrity and monotony and lack of culture and so on. So I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, liking it, or not having any great feelings one way or the other about it. Just it was the place I grew up in. So then I think when I went to the Bay Area, I tapped into that in terms of thinking of LA as the San Fernando Valley, perhaps, and not being aware of other things that it had to offer. So when I returned here to Venice, that opened up a whole new world that I didn't know about in Los Angeles. And then moving to Silver Lake, and then teaching all over the place in Los Angeles, gave me this greater appreciation of the diversity of Los Angeles. But again, that is a downside of Los Angeles that other cities maybe don't have as much, that you do have this isolation. You can fall into the trap of isolation and only looking at one slice of Los Angeles and not being aware of other parts. And that, there is that aspect to it.
David Kippen, the operator of Libros Schmibros, whom you talked to at the very end of this book and who's been a guest on this show, he signs his emails, as I'm sure you've seen, with this line. It says, "Los Angeles is like our brains. We only use 20% of it, but imagine what we could do if we could use more." I don't know if that's true about the brain, but certainly that's true of Los Angeles. The 20% is about the default people can fall back to, right?
And that taps into what I was just saying about people's awareness of Los Angeles. I mean, even in Silver Lake. In Silver Lake, my wife and I, when we first moved here, wanted to discover the place. We started walking around the area, and every day we would discover something fabulously new. And of course, Silver Lake, does have that to offer because of the hilly topography and the architectural history that we have here that's very rich, in terms of modernist architecture and so on, and the density that it has. It offers itself to, and we had the feeling, we could go on throughout our lives and not really even tap Silver Lake. Right. And this is a very small sliver of Los Angeles. And we are among those who pride ourselves in trying to discover new areas outside of Silver Lake as well. More recently it's been downtown, kind of rediscovering downtown as it's going through this major transformation as well, and other aspects of Los Angeles. So, again, you really have to maybe work harder to not fully, but appreciate Los Angeles more because of its tendency, maybe because of its size and the threateningness of that. It just seems overwhelming. It's intimidating in terms of its size and the multiplicity that you might fall back on your own little area. And then traffic can also hem you in there as well. So you're just not able to go out as readily and I find that in my class. I teach a class on Los Angeles, and many of the students are from Los Angeles. Increasingly now, it used to be a joke about Los Angeles is, they're all migrants to Los Angeles, very few natives. I was one of the few growing up in my school. So one of the first questions I ask is how many are from Los Angeles, and it's increased in number over time. But then when I have them go off on group projects to visit various sites around Los Angeles, I'm struck by how few of them, even from Los Angeles, know about them, such as Barnsdall Park. If I mention that now to your audience, how many of you have heard of Barnsdall Park, much less visited it? And it's one of the gems of Los Angeles.
For my own defense, I'll say I was picnicking there last weekend. So, but yes, I could have easily. You're right. I could have never known about it. I could as easily not know about it as know about it.
And of course, that's also one of the joys, when you discover this and say, wow, this has been under my nose all this time and I didn't know about it, and it's a well-kept secret, and you sort of want to keep it that way. Like Silver Lake now is allegedly the hipster capital of the world. No, we don't want people to know about that. Soon it won't be anymore, and it'll be gentrified, and of course it is becoming gentrified quite rapidly. So, yeah, again, there are all these paradoxical qualities about Los Angeles that, again, are part of its allure. And
you talk about this work that Los Angeles can require from you, and increasingly this is the way that I've described the appeal of the city to friends who ask why I came here, because it does demand that you master it, whether that means the knowing where things are, the geography, driving on the freeways, in my case, cycling, using the transit system, or learning the languages that are spoken here, or learning the food even. That mastery that it I don't know that it wants you to attain, but that you should attain to experience this place is itself appealing. Is that a sentiment you agree with? That's a strength of the city in terms of your experience, that it takes that?
No, I don't think that's a strength, because it will definitely decrease the number of people who can ultimately appreciate the city on that level. I've heard from some people who have visited Los Angeles, and I would agree. It helps to have know somebody here who knows Los Angeles a little bit better, so that they can show you some of these more hidden treasures within Los Angeles. Now, one I would send out, a recommendation for anyone, and this is the way I approach it when I have people from outside. I will do more than this, but I would recommend, and I tell my students this, if you have somebody from out of town, the way to give them a feel for Los Angeles initially is to travel along Sunset Boulevard, either from the ocean inward or from the inner city. And there you would start at Cesar Chavez Boulevard, which was originally, but at one point was Sunset Boulevard, was changed to Cesar Chavez. So you begin in Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles. And in some sense, you're starting historically because Los Angeles was a Mexican city, right? So in that sense, it's even the best way to go. I guess, evolutionarily, you could say it's better to start with the ocean. You catch my okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. But in terms of starting a little more recent period, let's start in Boyle Heights. Okay. Cesar Chavez and even the notion that Sunset Boulevard was changed to Cesar Chavez Boulevard has something to offer. And then you go through Boyle Heights, you go through downtown, you go through the plaza, which is the founding center of Los Angeles. You have Chinatown, and then you go through Echo Park, you go through Silver Lakes, you're going into still more Latino areas, but you're going through the hipster areas, and then you get into Hollywood, and then into West Hollywood, and then to Beverly Hills, and then into Brentwood, Westwood, and Holmby Hills, and then, and as you're doing this, you might have as a companion piece, you could have it on your smartphone now. You could be showing Sunset Boulevard, on your smartphone as they're driving along Sunset Boulevard. And then you, of course, pass the freeway and you're into Brentwood and then the Pacific Palisades and then you're at the Pacific Ocean. And you've gone through this tremendous historical and geographic and demographic parade or odyssey, if you will, through Los Angeles. I think that's a good way to start. And then you move out from there. I mean, one thing Banham did was striking in the movie. He didn't do that in his book. I don't think he talked about Watts Towers in his book.
Brief mention.
Very brief in the mention. But then it's a big deal in the movie when it's one of the first things he does. And again, I would say a large majority of Los Angeles has never heard of the Watts Towers, even among natives in Los Angeles. I know that from my class, among the Los Angelesans, they haven't heard of it. And of course, when they hear Watts Towers, we don't want to go there. But you get people from out of town, and that's another aspect. People from out of town, besides a good thing to have somebody that knows Los Angeles, sometimes they know more about Los Angeles in terms of these offbeat kinds of things that most natives don't know than many Angelenos do. So Watts Towers, of course, is something to see. And he goes there right off the bat. And describes that.
That is a place that he goes right off the bat, and it is often the place I take visitors right off the bat. I'm not quite sure why, but it seems to have some talismanic key to Los Angeles element to it, does it not?
Yes. I think one of the reasons for it is it's the disconnect there, or the shattering of cliches, if you will, about Watts. The people from out of town have probably heard about Watts and the Watts riots, and so you're saying you're going to Watts as the first thing?
As if the riots were still happening right there.
Yes, and they would be endangered if they go there, and, are we slumming here to go to Watts Towers? So I think that's part of it. You're going to this place which you think of in a negative way, and then you're showing, this cultural icon. And so it's somehow the contrast that I think is part of its appeal there. And then, of course, it's folk art. I don't know if that plays some role there. That it's something different from going to a museum or something. It's kind of living art, if you will. So that's some aspect to it as well. And I mean, talking about museums, just museums in Los Angeles now. I know there's some wealthy benefactor that goes around the world and contributes money to cultural organizations. I can't think of his name now. He lives in hotels. He's a billionaire. Well known. I can't think of his name. And he's focusing on Los Angeles a lot now. And he was saying he was a little bit disappointed that the what could be a kind of museum center of Los Angeles, which it sort of has become, and that's the LACMA complex now, with the Eli Broad Center there, and the refurbishing that they've gone through there as well, and now the Rock, which we could talk about as well. But there are multiple little museums in that complex, and I think across the street now there's a design center, and the May Company is maybe turned into the Academy, the Motion Picture Academy Museum now. And he was bemoaning the fact that that could be a hub so that people from out of town would come and they would have all these museums in one place. But that's a mistake in terms of Los Angeles. You want to be able to go to different parts of Los Angeles. That forces you to go to Pasadena, to the Norton Simon, to go to downtown for MoCA, to go to the African American Museum here, to go to the Latino Museum in Long Beach or something. That's a way to get you to go to those places. And the Getty Museum, up there, which is a fabulous place as well. Another way to get another view of Los Angeles, literally. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another strength of Los Angeles. Now, other cities have that too, where they have museums in different parts of the town. But yeah, I think that's a misreading of Los Angeles to want to kind of have everything concentrated there. And people have talked that about downtown too. We don't want downtown. We don't want a traditional downtown. Right. But again, that would just be one part of Los Angeles again. So you have that. You have the old city in downtown, but you have the rest of the city that is still Los Angeles. So what were we talking about there? Oh, well, no, the Rock. No, that just gets us into a personal opinion about art, I think. But I don't get the Rock. Maybe you do. I was really quite disappointed in it when I went to it. I mean, it was great, the happening in terms of it traveling, again, through the streets of Los Angeles.
They had to get the huge thing there.
They should have stopped there,
Right. Just like they had to get the Endeavor.
Yeah,
through the streets. Moving big things through the streets is in the 21st century a Los Angeles pursuit, it seems.
Yes, it's the journey, right? Not the end point that is important, because the end point to me is a big disappointment. I find. I mean, I know Christopher Knight, whom I respect as an art critic, is a little more favorably inclined to it. But I just don't get it, and I regard myself as somebody who's somewhat sensitive. I have a master's degree in art, and I appreciate art and modern art and postmodern art, but this doesn't do it for me. And in fact, I find it not only disappointing, disheartening from its ecological standpoint, because allegedly it's earth art, and earth art comes from an ecologically, environmentally tapped-in position. Much of earth art is drawing your attention, to progressive attitudes about nature and the environment. And maybe this is doing it in a paradoxical way, but the fact that it's not so much the Rock, but it's surrounded by this kind of desert of gravel. So it's not doing the environment any good by doing that, nor is it really reflecting the reality of Los Angeles, which, again, a misnomer about Los Angeles is that it was a desert. It was not a desert. It was surrounded by desert and still is surrounded by some, but it was not a full-fledged desert. It actually had quite a lot of vegetation in it. So that's also something that is misinterpreted about Los Angeles too. In Chinatown, that's one of the major lines is Los Angeles is a desert community, and so on. And it seems to be playing on that, which again does a disservice, if you will, to what Los Angeles is all about. But anyway, I could go off on that a little bit more.
You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation a word I want to return to, which is rhetoric, because this book grows out of classes on the rhetoric of Los Angeles that you've taught and alluded to. Tell me what you've gotten, what it gave this book and gave your understanding of Los Angeles, that you've been talking to so many students, interacting with so many students about Los Angeles, teaching them about it. What has that taught you?
Well, of course, much of my research came about in terms of teaching the course and learning more about Los Angeles to be able to teach about it. And that research continues and will continue, just as discovering Silver Lake or discovering Los Angeles is an ongoing process. But, yes, this class was imposed on me. I didn't choose the course. I didn't develop it myself. And I'm very grateful, and I mentioned in my acknowledgments my gratitude to those who offered me this opportunity to look at Los Angeles from the standpoint of the rhetoric of Los Angeles, which I think I began the discussion with in terms of the history of Los Angeles being so much enmeshed with its rhetoric, more so than most cities. And you can't separate the two. I quote, if I can find the quote here. Yes, I just want to get this individual's name right that I would quote. John Bunton, who's written a major book about Los Angeles recently, had bemoaned, as many have, this distortion of history or burying of history or forgetting of history, as Norman Klein puts it about Los Angeles, which is, a problematic aspect that should not be buried and denied. But then John Russell Taylor has pointed out that most of the legends of Los Angeles are true, even when they're contradictory. And that's what I try to get across in my book, that this myth and rhetoric and reality converge, and intersect in Los Angeles to an inextricable degree, so that they're part and parcel of the same thing. Not that one shouldn't, go to the postmodern extreme of moral relativism and say there's no there's no reality now, it's all, all a fabrication, and so what? No, one should still try to, get at the truth as much as one can. But part of the truth of Los Angeles is this mingling of myth and reality. And again, Hollywood just enhances that further. So in terms of the rhetoric of Los Angeles, that's what I'm trying to get across to my students, is how closely they are in contact. And then when I have them go off and visit actual historical sites, that's what they should examine. When they go to these places like Olvera Street or Chinatown or wherever it might be, how much the rhetoric is part of the reality of that place. And, again, that's true to a certain degree as well. When I gave a talk recently at the Autry Museum, and I had a very good question posed to me, that I bring up the palimpsest in relation to Los Angeles, this multi-layered facet, historically and otherwise, about Los Angeles, and how these various layers have been covered up and distorted and buried, and yet traces remain and percolate to the surface. And the question was, is that distinctive about Los Angeles? Don't other places have that as well? And of course, in my book, I don't propose that it's absolutely unique to Los Angeles, but it is a major facet of what makes Los Angeles special, I think, partly in terms of these layers that are more distinctively delineated, that if you look at a cross-section, let's say, looking at it archaeologically or geologically, and if you took a, historical, looking at metaphorically now, historical side view cross-section of Los Angeles history, you could see these demarcations, the Indian period and the Spanish period and the Mexican period, the American period, the Hollywood period, and the multicultural period are pretty, you have pretty close dates that you can pinpoint there. But then there's Hollywood, which adds this other element of layering that is unique to Los Angeles, that complicates the whole process and adds another layer of confusion, but again, intersection of those notions of rhetoric and reality. Because Hollywood is a real place, right? And there are real people. And as the various Hollywood films that I show and discuss in the book also do, they always emphasize how Hollywood is an industry. There are workers here, and there are actual material things that we deal with to give you those illusions. Now it's maybe more cyberspatial today, than it has been with CGI and so on. But there's still thousands of people, clicking those mouses, to create these illusions. So there is that reality to it. But you can see that in the Hollywood films, their sense of defensiveness about this, when they emphasize it is an industry, the whole notion of the film industry that they are proud of. And then it can be turned against itself in terms of the culture industry and the dream factory,
Hollywood, of course, is, to my mind, a real place with real good Thai restaurants, now that I think about it. In these days, in post-multicultural Los Angeles. But finally, Whether you're writing this book for readers or whether you're teaching students about the rhetoric of Los Angeles, how much is it your goal to enable readers and students to, shall we say, read the palimpsest of Los Angeles? How much is that the skill you want to cultivate?
Okay, I think one of the major goals, and I think I somewhat achieved that, not in an absolute sense. There are others who can carry this forward, but I think what's unique about my book is there's quite a bit of primary research involved in it, in some of the interviews I did and some of the places I went and rediscovered and some of my textual analysis. But it's really bringing it all together, if you will. There have been wonderful books that go into much greater depth than I do about various facets in terms of Hollywood, in terms of the ethno-racial background, in terms of the historical elements, but they're focusing on one aspect or another, more or less. Whereas my attempt here was to bring a lot of these things together. So in a more accessible way, if you will, but without dumbing it down, give you this broader view, if you will. And then you can go into these other elements through the footnoting and so on and explore them further and in greater depth. So it's a holistic approach, if you will, to Los Angeles that has not been done, to my estimation, to the degree that I try to accomplish it here anyway. So it's a good place to start, to give you an overview and a sense of the complexity of Los Angeles, which you then can, as Los Angeles itself, can then go and discover further for yourself. So that's what I try to do with the class, and from the reaction I've gotten from students, it seems to succeed on that level, even from, or maybe and especially for the Los Angeles natives, who are given a renewed appreciation of the city that they thought they knew, but...
I've been speaking here in Silver Lake with Vincent Brook, who teaches at USC, UCLA, Cal State Los Angeles, and Pierce College, author of books on Jewish émigré film directors and film noir, as well as the Jewish sitcom, as well as the new Land of Smoke and Mirrors, a cultural history of Los Angeles that I might add, dear listeners, has some of the most fascinating and richest wordplay I have seen in a book of this kind, and that's reason enough to read it, even if you don't care at all about Los Angeles. Vincent, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Noman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.